This video goes over section 4.4, which is titled Considerations when Sampling. And the main focus here is different types of bias. So bias occurs when something causes a tendency to over or estimate the population parameter, right? So this creates bias. We had 4 different types of bias that they talk about in this lesson. So I'm going to go through each one's definition and then give an example and talk about why those are an example of this type of bias. So for undercoverage bias, that's when some members of the population are less likely to be or cannot be chosen. And so an example of this is to estimate the proportion of city residents who shop online. A researcher visits a mall on a weekday morning and asks people she encounters to share their experiences with online shopping, including this question: do you shop online at least once each week? The results show that 32% of shoppers shop online at least once per week. So this is an example of undercoverage bias because they only chose one day and one time to conduct their survey. So if we think about weekday mornings, a lot of people work on weekday mornings. And so using different days and different times of day to conduct the survey would be a better way to not have this undercoverage bias happen. So the reason that it's undercoverage bias is that people in the workforce and many younger people, because typically younger people sleep in or might be at work too, school, could be excluded, right? So you want to get a sample that is conducted on different days at different times in order to avoid undercoverage bias. The next type of bias is non-response bias. So non-response bias occurs when individuals chosen for the sample can't be contacted or refuse to participate. So the example for this is that an executive for a large company is considering a change to health insurance plans offered to the employees. To assess employee satisfaction with the current plan, the executive sends an email to all company employees asking their opinion of the current plan. A summary of the results received shows that 27% of employees are highly satisfied with the current health insurance plan. And so they just sent an email to all employees. So that required the employees to respond to that email. So remember, we talked about with voluntary response surveys, they're likely to be biased because people have to then, it's on them to return the answer to the survey. So an indicator of this being non-response bias is that if they were really satisfied, they might not respond. Okay, so when you're conducting some sort of survey, right, non-response is an issue when for some reason they just can't be contacted, which wasn't the case here, right? They work for him, so they know their emails. It's the fact that these people refuse to participate. The next one is response bias. So response bias is a systematic pattern of inaccurate answers to a survey question. So the example that I have for you is a restaurant chain would like to measure the proportion of customers who are generally satisfied with the service provided by its staff. At the end of the meal, as the check is delivered to the table, the server asks the table to rate their satisfaction with the service provided as very satisfied, satisfied, or not satisfied. During a 1-week period, 147 customers were surveyed and 135, or 93%, reported they were either satisfied or very satisfied. So this is a response bias example because the server is literally the one asking you whether you were satisfied with their service. And so customers may not respond truthfully because of the person that is conducting the survey, okay? So it's important that this survey is anonymous so that we can avoid this bias for the response bias survey type. For question wording, the question wording is when questions that are confusing, leading, vague, or missing important information cause this bias. And so they gave examples of vague in the videos. One thing to make note of is that leading questions, that's when the wording of the question kind of indicates what response they want from you. So you can predict what they want you to say based on the way that they worded the question, which is what this example is going to be. So residents of a community pay for a fee for recreational services in their neighborhood, such as tennis courts, running trails, and a pool. To assess whether there is support for raising the fee of the upcoming summer, a random sample of 50 residents is contacted and asked the question, would you support a $10 increase in the recreational fee to support programs for the health and well-being of children in the community? And so this is leading because they're kind of appealing to you and being like, you don't care about children if you don't want this fee increase, right? And so they're leading you to get a positive response for this question by including that in their question. So the last thing that is important in this is being able to identify whether this is an overestimate or an underestimate of the responses. So because this leads you to a positive response, this will overestimate the positive. The same thing will happen with the previous example. So in the response, because you're not likely to tell the server they did a bad job, it's going to overestimate the satisfaction. Whereas the non-response example, if satisfied employees may not respond, it's going to underestimate the satisfaction. And then for the last one, because remember they only did this in weekday mornings, and so only 32% of shoppers shopped online, this was an underestimate likely because they're not getting a good sample of people that work during the day or in the morning or are not awake or something like that. Okay, so within the types of bias, remember that you need to be able to differentiate between the four and be able to tell whether the scenario will overestimate or underestimate the population parameters.